The desert wind howled across the Badlands, carrying red dust that stung the eyes and choked the throat. In the fading light of another brutal day, the sun painted the sky in shades of blood and copper, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. The sandstone mesas stood like ancient sentinels, their weathered faces bearing witness to countless tales of sorrow and survival in this unforgiving land. The year was 1873, and the frontier town of Bitter Creek squatted at the edge of nowhere, a collection of sun-bleached buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the Arizona Territory. It was here, in this place where civilized men liked to pretend they brought order to chaos, that the worst of humanity often showed its face. The Navajo girl stumbled as rough hands shoved her forward, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. She couldn't have been more than 19 summers, though the recent days of captivity had aged her face. Her dark eyes, once bright with the freedom of her people, now held the wariness of a wounded animal. Blood had dried on a gash along her shoulder, and her traditional woven dress hung torn at the hem, dusty from the long march. "Move along, savage," growled Jake Harmon, the leader of the traders. He was a man whose soul had been sold long before he'd taken up the business of selling others. His partner, a wiry fellow named Curtis Webb, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and laughed. "Ain't worth much, this one," Webb observed, eyeing their captive with the cold calculation of a man appraising livestock. "No family left to ransom her back, and she won't speak a lick of English. Stubborn as a mule, too." The girl understood more than they knew, but she kept her knowledge hidden behind a mask of defiance. She had learned some of their language from the missions before her village had been scattered to the winds, before the soldiers came, before the sickness took her parents, before these men had found her trying to survive alone in the canyons. The makeshift auction block was nothing more than a wooden platform hastily erected in front of Morrison's general store. A small crowd had gathered, mostly out of morbid curiosity rather than genuine interest. Times were hard, and most folks could barely feed themselves, let alone take on another mouth to feed. "Gentlemen," Harmon called out, though the term was generous for the assembled group, "we got ourselves a young Navajo woman here, strong enough for work, young enough to learn proper ways. What am I bid?" The crowd shuffled uncomfortably. A few men leered, but their wives' sharp elbows quickly discouraged any interest. The local preacher shook his head and turned away. Even in a place where morality was often negotiable, the selling of human beings sat uneasily with some $5, someone finally called out, more as a joke than a serious offer. $5? Harmon scoffed. "Why? She's worth at least." "She's worth nothing," Webb interrupted, growing impatient. "Look at her. Won't talk, won't work proper, and that wound on her shoulder's likely to fester. We're wasting daylight here." Standing at the back of the crowd, Thomas McKenna watched the proceedings with a mixture of disgust and something else, something he couldn't quite name. At 35, he was neither young nor old, but the years had worn grooves in his face like water-carving stone. His wife, Mary, had been dead 2 winters now, taken by the fever that had swept through the territory. Since then, he'd worked his small ranch alone, speaking more to his horses than to people. He hadn't come to town for this spectacle. He'd only needed supplies, flour, salt, perhaps some seed for the spring planting if he could afford it. But something about the girl's bearing, the way she held her chin high despite the circumstances, stirred something in him. $10, he heard himself say, the word surprising him as much as anyone. The crowd turned to look at him. Thomas McKenna was known as a fair man, if a solitary one. His ranch sat 15 miles from town, and he rarely socialized beyond the necessary commerce. Well, Harmon grinned, revealing teeth stained by tobacco and neglect. "The hermit farmer speaks. $10 it is. Anyone else?" Silence stretched across the square. A tumbleweed rolled past, pushed by the evening wind. The girl's eyes found Thomas's face, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he didn't. "Sold," Webb declared, eager to be done with it. "Pay up, McKenna." Thomas approached slowly, pulling the coins from his leather pouch. It was most of what he'd saved for supplies. But something beyond reason compelled him as he handed over the money. Harmon chuckled. "You just bought yourself a worthless Navajo girl, McKenna. Hope you know what you're doing." "They sold a worthless Navajo girl," Thomas said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But perhaps worth isn't something men like you can measure." The crowd dispersed, some shaking their heads at McKenna's foolishness, others whispering about what a man living alone might want with a young Indian woman. Thomas ignored them all, focusing instead on the immediate problem of the rope binding her wrists. He drew his knife, and she tensed. "Easy," he said softly, the same tone he used with spooked horses. The blade cut through the rope, and she rubbed her wrists, eyeing him with continued wariness. "You got a horse?" he asked, then realized the futility of the question. Of course she didn't. He sighed, looking at his own mount, a sturdy bay mare named Buttercup. "You can ride with me. Ranch is a fair piece from here." She stood still, making no move toward the horse. Thomas understood. Trust wasn't something that came easy, especially not after what she'd been through. He gathered his few purchased supplies, securing them to the saddlebags, then mounted up. He extended his hand down to her. For a long moment, she simply stared at his weathered palm. Then, with a grace that belied her exhaustion, she grasped it and allowed him to pull her up behind him. She sat rigidly, careful not to touch him more than necessary. As they rode out of Bitter Creek, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of purple and gray. The temperature began to drop, as it always did once the sun abandoned the land. Thomas felt her shiver slightly behind him and made a mental note to give her his coat once they stopped to rest. He didn't know what had possessed him to intervene. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the memory of his Mary, who had always said he had a soft heart beneath his quiet exterior. Or maybe it was simply the recognition of another soul who knew what it meant to be alone in a world that had taken everything. Whatever the reason, Thomas McKenna had just changed the course of 2 lives. As Buttercup picked her way carefully along the rutted trail leading away from town, neither rider could have imagined what lay ahead. The desert stretched endlessly before them, both beautiful and terrible, holding secrets and promises in equal measure. Behind them, the lights of Bitter Creek grew dim, and ahead, somewhere in the vast darkness, waited a small ranch where 2 broken people would either find redemption or destroy what little they had left. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of sage and the distant threat of rain, and in that moment, beneath the first stars of evening, a story of unlikely love began to write itself across the canvas of the American frontier. The journey stretched before them like an endless ribbon of dust and stone. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when the wind began to change, carrying with it the metallic taste that preceded a sandstorm. Thomas had lived in this territory long enough to read the signs, the way the horses grew skittish, the peculiar stillness that fell over the desert creatures, the wall of brown rising on the horizon like a living thing. "Storm coming," he said over his shoulder, though he wasn't sure she understood. Buttercup whinnied nervously, her ears flattening against her head. The Navajo girl's grip on the back of his jacket tightened almost imperceptibly. The sandstorm hit them with the force of 1,000 tiny bullets. The world disappeared into a howling brown void, and Thomas could barely see Buttercup's ears in front of him. He felt the girl press closer to his back, sheltering against him as the wind tried to tear them from the saddle. Through the chaos, Thomas spotted the dark outline of a rock formation, a small overhang carved by centuries of wind and rain. He guided Buttercup toward it, trusting the mare's instincts more than his own obscured vision. They dismounted in the relative shelter of the rocks, and Thomas quickly hobbled the horse to keep her from bolting. The space beneath the overhang was cramped but protected. Thomas pressed himself against one wall, giving the girl as much room as possible. She huddled in the opposite corner, her dark eyes watching him through the swirling dust that still found its way into their shelter. From his saddlebags, Thomas pulled out his canteen and a worn blanket. He took a small sip of water, then held the canteen out to her. She stared at it for a long moment before accepting, drinking sparingly despite what must have been a powerful thirst. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed briefly. She jerked away as if burned, retreating deeper into her corner. Thomas pretended not to notice, busying himself with shaking out the blanket. He set it on the ground between them, a peace offering. "For you," he said, gesturing at the blanket. When she made no move to take it, he sighed and pulled out a piece of hardtack from his supplies. He broke it in half, placed one piece on the blanket, and began gnawing on the other. The storm raged outside their shelter, but within the small space, a different kind of tension filled the air. Thomas found himself studying her in quick glances. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, there was something fierce about her, something unbroken. The wound on her shoulder had started bleeding again, likely aggravated by the ride. He pulled out a relatively clean bandana from his pocket and dampened it with water from the canteen. Slowly, telegraphing his movements, he reached toward her shoulder. She shrank back, her hand moving to where a knife might have been if she'd had one. "Just trying to help," he said softly. He pointed to her shoulder, then to the bandana. "It needs cleaning." She remained still as stone while he carefully dabbed at the wound. This close, he could see the pattern of her breathing, the way she held herself ready to flee or fight. When he finished, he sat back, giving her space again. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it grew worse, the wind screaming like a living thing. They would be here for hours, perhaps until dawn. Thomas pulled out his tobacco pouch, then thought better of it. The small space was already hard enough to breathe in. Time passed strangely in the darkness of the storm. Thomas dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time to check on both the girl and Buttercup. The girl never seemed to sleep, those watchful eyes glinting in the darkness whenever lightning illuminated their shelter. It was during one of these lightning flashes that he saw she had finally wrapped herself in the blanket. A small victory. He thought she had also eaten the hard tack, though the effort must have cost her pride dearly. When the storm finally began to die with the coming of dawn, Thomas ventured out to check on Buttercup. The mare had weathered the storm well, though she was covered in dust and clearly eager to move on. He gave her water from his dwindling supply and a handful of oats from his saddlebag. When he returned to the overhang, he found the girl standing at its entrance, gazing out at the transformed landscape. The storm had rearranged the desert, creating new dunes and exposing previously buried rocks. She said something in her own language, soft and musical. "Ready to go?" Thomas asked, though he knew she couldn't understand. He made a gesture toward the horse, and she nodded once. Economically, the rest of the journey to his ranch passed in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of Buttercup's hooves. The sun climbed higher, baking the moisture from the earth and from their bodies. Thomas gave the girl his hat, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation, pulling it low over her eyes. When his ranch finally came into view, Thomas felt a familiar mixture of pride and shame. It wasn't much, a small wooden house with a sagging porch, a barn that leaked in 3 places, and a corral that needed constant repair. The vegetable garden Mary had once tended with such care had gone mostly to seed, though a few stubborn plants still clung to life. His small herd of cattle, no more than a dozen head, grazed in the distance. They were thin, ribs showing through their hides. The drought had been hard on everyone, man and beast alike. He helped the girl down from Buttercup, noting how she swayed slightly on her feet before catching herself. Inside the house, he showed her around with gestures and simple words. "Kitchen," he said, pointing. "Bedroom." He indicated the single room where Mary's things still sat on the dresser, untouched. "You sleep here?" She looked at him questioningly, and he pointed to himself, then to the barn. "I'll sleep out there." It wasn't ideal, but it was proper. Whatever the townspeople might think, Thomas McKenna intended to do right by this girl. He pumped water from the well into a basin and set it on the kitchen table, along with a clean cloth and a bar of lye soap. She approached these items cautiously, as if they might be some kind of trap. "For you," he said again, making washing motions. Then he stepped outside, giving her privacy. Standing on his porch, looking out at his struggling ranch, Thomas wondered what in God's name he had done. He had spent most of his money on a girl who couldn't speak his language, who looked at him like he might attack her at any moment. His supplies were low, his cattle were failing, and now he had another mouth to feed. But then he remembered the look in her eyes back at that auction block, proud and unbroken despite everything. He thought of Mary, how she would have been appalled at what he'd witnessed in town. "Every soul deserves dignity, Thomas," she used to say. "That's what separates us from the animals." When he finally went back inside, he found the girl cleaned up and standing by the window, watching the horizon. The clean water had revealed the fine bones of her face, the elegant line of her neck. She had tried to fix her torn dress as best she could. Thomas busied himself making a simple meal, beans and salt pork, with some of the dried apples Mary had put up 2 years ago. He set 2 plates on the table and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. She sat carefully, as if the chair might give way beneath her. When she saw him bow his head to say grace, she remained still, watching. He kept the prayer short, adding a silent request for wisdom in this strange situation he'd created. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less sharp, more like the quiet between strangers who might someday be something else. When she finished, she looked at him and spoke a single word in accented English. "Why?" Thomas set down his fork, considering why indeed. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "Just didn't seem right, what they were doing." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded as if this made sense to her. She pointed to herself and said something in Navajo, then repeated it slower. He tried to copy the sounds, mangling them terribly. The corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Thomas," he said, pointing to himself. "Thomas McKenna." She repeated it carefully. "Thomas." It was a start. That night, as Thomas bedded down in the barn with the horses and the scant warmth of old hay, he thought about the long road ahead. Trust would come slowly, if at all. Communication would be a daily struggle. The ranch work would be harder than ever, and the whispers from town would be cruel. But for the first time in 2 years, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. Somewhere in the house, a lonely girl was probably lying awake, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Thomas found himself wondering the same thing, but for the first time in a long while, the uncertainty didn't feel quite so heavy. The desert night sang its ancient song, coyotes in the distance, the whisper of wind through sage, the settling of old wood, and beneath it all, the quiet breathing of 2 souls finding themselves unexpectedly tethered, for better or worse, in this harsh and beautiful land. The days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing, though not without its awkward moments. Thomas would rise before dawn, finding her already awake, sitting on the porch watching the sun paint the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. She had taken to wearing one of Mary's old dresses, though she'd modified it somehow to better suit her movements. The skirt shortened for easier walking. The sleeves rolled and tied. Their communication evolved through necessity. Thomas would point to things and say their English names. She would respond with the Navajo words. "Water," he'd say, holding up the bucket. "2," she'd reply. By the end of the first week, they had built a small vocabulary between them, practical words for practical needs. The fence work came first. Winter storms had knocked down entire sections, and the cattle had been wandering freely, grazing wherever they pleased. Thomas showed her how to hold the posts while he hammered, how to stretch the wire taut. Her hands, he noticed, were not soft. They bore the calluses of someone who had known hard work. One morning, she surprised him by having the tools laid out and ready before he'd even finished his coffee. She pointed to the damaged section near the creek and said, "Fix." The word was heavily accented but clear. "Yes," he said, unable to hide his smile. "We fix." They worked side by side through the morning heat. When the sun reached its zenith, she disappeared briefly. returning with water for them both and strips of dried meat she must have prepared when he wasn't watching. They sat in the sparse shade of a mesquite tree, sharing the simple meal. It was then she began to speak, haltingly at first, mixing English words with Navajo. Thomas couldn't understand most of it, but he recognized the rhythm of storytelling. Her hands moved as she spoke, painting pictures in the air. He caught fragments, something about her father, horses, a place with the red rocks and clear water. When she fell silent, he felt the weight of expectation. She had shared something, now it was his turn. "My wife," he began slowly. "Mary. She died 2 winters ago. Fever took her." He touched his chest, over his heart. "Still hurts here?" She nodded, understanding grief if not all the words. She pointed to herself and made a cutting motion across her heart, then spread her arms wide, encompassing the empty landscape. Her family was gone too, scattered to the winds or worse. The early winter arrived suddenly, as it often did in the high desert. Thomas woke one morning to find frost on the ground and ice in the water buckets. He found her in the kitchen, a fire already crackling in the stove. Coffee brewing. She'd learned his morning routine and anticipated it. "Cold," she said, one of her newer English words, wrapping her arms around herself. "Very cold," he agreed, grateful for the warmth and the coffee that afternoon, as they worked to bring the cattle closer to the barn for shelter. The first snow began to fall. Fat, lazy flakes drifted down from a gray sky. She stopped working to watch, holding out her hand to catch the snowflakes. Something in her expression, wonder mixed with memory, made Thomas's chest tight. "Yes," she said softly. "Snow." Then, teaching him as he had taught her, "Snow is yes." That night, the wind howled fierce enough to rattle the windows. Thomas had moved back into the house a week prior, sleeping on a bedroll in the main room. The barn had simply become too cold. He lay awake listening to the storm, wondering if she was warm enough in the bedroom. A soft sound made him sit up. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, shivering despite the layers. She said something in Navajo, then tried English. "Too cold. Alone." Thomas understood. He built up the fire in the main room until it roared, then dragged his bedroll closer to the hearth. She settled on the floor nearby, still wrapped in her blanket. They lay there, not touching but sharing the circle of warmth, while the storm raged outside. "In my home," she said suddenly, her English improving daily, "we tell stories when the snow comes, stories of first man and first woman, of changing woman and the hero twins." Her voice was soft, musical. "My grandmother, she knew all stories. She teach me." "Tell me," Thomas said, and she did. Her English faltered sometimes, and she'd slip back into Navajo. But Thomas found himself caught up in the rhythm of her voice more than the words themselves. She told of a world where animals spoke and gods walked the earth, where every rock and tree had a spirit, where harmony and balance were the highest virtues. When she finished, the fire had burned low. "Your turn," she said. "You tell story." Thomas wasn't much of a storyteller, but he tried. He told her about growing up in Ohio, about coming west with dreams of gold that turned into dreams of a land. He told her about meeting Mary at a church social, how she'd laughed at his clumsy dancing but agreed to marry him anyway. "She would have liked you," he said without thinking, then felt heat rise to his face. In the flickering firelight, he thought he saw her smile, a real smile, not just the ghost of one. "She teach you to be good man," she said. "I see this." The storm had quieted. In the silence that followed, Thomas became acutely aware of their proximity. When he looked at her, she was watching him with those dark, fathomless eyes. Something passed between them, not quite attraction, not yet, but an acknowledgement of possibility. She rose gracefully, gathering her blanket. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, and padded back to the bedroom. Thomas lay awake for a long time, staring at the dying embers. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 2 years had receded, replaced by something more complex. He was beginning to care for this woman whose name he still couldn't properly pronounce. whose past remained largely a mystery, whose presence had somehow made his failing ranch feel like a home again. The next morning dawned clear and brilliantly cold. The snow lay thick on the ground, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. When Thomas entered the kitchen, he found her teaching herself to read from one of Mary's old books, a Bible, the only book in the house. She looked up at him, frustration clear on her face. "These marks," she said, pointing at the words. "They speak?" "They speak," he confirmed. He sat beside her, careful to maintain proper distance. "This word is God. This one is light." Her finger traced the letters with intense concentration. "God," she repeated. "Light." Then, with a spark of connection. "Like Yahitso-Nayi, the big God, and like the sun, Adinidian, light." They spent the morning like that, huddled over the book while snow fell softly outside. She was a quick learner, making connections he hadn't expected. When they finally looked up, the sun was high and the snow had stopped. "We need firewood," Thomas said, already dreading the cold work of splitting logs. She nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. When she emerged, she wore men's work clothes, some of Thomas's old things she must have altered to fit. The sight was so unexpected he nearly laughed, but the determined set of her jaw stopped him. "I help," she said firmly, and she did. While he split the logs, she stacked them, creating neat rows against the house. When his back began to ache, an old injury from his younger days, she took the axe from his hands without a word and began splitting the smaller pieces herself. Her form was different from his, more fluid, but effective. That night, as they sat by the fire again, it had become their custom now. She told him her name. "Ayana," she said carefully. "It means eternal blossom in your language. My grandmother chose it. Said I would bloom even in the hardest ground." "Ayana," Thomas repeated, tasting the syllables. "It's beautiful. My father called me Yana when I was small." She continued, her eyes distant with memory. "Before the soldiers came, before the long walk to the place of imprisonment, before the sickness took them." Thomas wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he kept his hands still. Some pain was too deep for touch to heal. "I survived," she said simply. "Alone, hiding in the canyons, eating what the land gave. Then the traders found me." Her voice hardened. "They saw something to sell, not someone to save." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, the words inadequate but necessary. She looked at him then, really looked at him. "You saved me, Thomas, not from death. I know how to survive. You saved me from becoming nothing, from disappearing like smoke." She touched her chest, over her heart. "You saw me as human." The fire crackled between them. Outside, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief's tight grip. "We save each other," he said quietly. "This place was dying before you came. Now." He gestured around the warm room, at the evidence of their shared work, at the life that had returned to the ranch. Ayana nodded slowly. "Ho's ho," she said. "Balance, harmony, we make it together." As winter deepened around them, bringing longer nights and closer quarters, Thomas found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the way she'd laughed when he mangled Navajo words, to the fierce concentration on her face as she practiced writing English letters. The ranch was still struggling, the future uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt like a future worth fighting for. The woman he'd bought to save had become his salvation in return, teaching him that sometimes the most profound connections grow in the most unexpected ground, like her name promised, an eternal blossom in the hardest soil. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and revealing the damage winter had wrought. But it also brought something else, whispers from town that reached the ranch like poison on the wind. Thomas first heard them when he went to Morrison's for supplies, leaving Ayana at the ranch despite her protests that she could help. "McKenna's lost his mind," He overheard Dolores Wickham saying to another woman near the fabric bolts, "Living in sin with that savage girl. His poor Mary must be turning in her grave." Thomas's hands tightened on the bag of flour he was lifting, but he forced himself to continue shopping as if he'd heard nothing. Morrison himself was cordial enough, though his eyes held questions he didn't dare voice. "Haven't seen you much this winter, McKenna," the shopkeeper said while tallying the bill. "Been busy with the ranch." Thomas replied evenly. "Winter was hard on the fences." "I'll bet," Morrison muttered, and Thomas chose to ignore the implication. The ride home felt longer than usual, the supplies heavier with the weight of the town's judgment. When he arrived at the ranch, he found Ayanna in the garden plot, turning the soil with the same focused intensity she brought to every task. She'd changed so much in the months since winter. Her English was now fluid if accented, her movements around the ranch confident and sure. She looked up at his approach, and her smile faltered when she saw his expression. "What happened?" "Nothing," he said, but she knew him too well now. That evening, as they shared supper, she finally drew it out of him. "The town talks," he admitted. "About us. About you living here." "Ah," she said, setting down her fork. "They think I warm your bed." Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. Despite their growing closeness, they had maintained careful boundaries. He still slept in the main room, she in the bedroom. They were partners in work, companions in the evening, but nothing more, though lately, Thomas had caught himself wondering what more might feel like. "Let them talk," Ayanna said firmly. "Their words are like dust. Wind blows them away." But the wind brought more than words. 3 days later, Thomas was repairing the chicken coop when he heard horses approaching. 5 men rode up, whiskey-brave and mean-spirited. He recognized them, Jake Harmon and Curtis Webb, the traders who had sold Ayanna, along with 3 cowboys from the Broken Spur Ranch. "Well, well," Harmon drawled, not bothering to dismount. "Heard you were playing house with our little Navajo princess, McKenna." Thomas straightened slowly, his hand moving casually toward the hammer at his belt. "State your business or move along." "In our business," Webb laughed. An ugly sound. "We're thinking maybe we sold that girl too cheap. Market's gone up for young squaws, if you know what I mean. Besides," one of the cowboys added, swaying in his saddle, "ain't right. A white man keeping an Indian girl. What would your dead wife think?" Thomas felt rage rise in his throat like bile. "You boys are drunk. Best head back to town before you do something stupid." "Stupid?" Harmon's face darkened. "Like spending good money on a worthless savage?" The kitchen door opened, and Ayanna stepped onto the porch. She'd heard everything, Thomas realized. She stood straight-backed, chin high, wearing one of the dresses she'd modified, part frontier woman, part Navajo, wholly herself. "Not worthless," she said clearly. "Not savage. I am Ayanna of the Bitterwater clan, daughter of warriors, and I stand on this land by my own choice." The cowboys laughed, but there was an edge of uneasiness to it now. Something in her bearing, in the steady way she met their eyes, unsettled them. "Your choice?" Webb spat. "McKenna bought you fair and square. Your property. Girl." "No," Thomas said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but carried the promise of violence. "She's a free woman, working this ranch same as any hired hand, and you're trespassing." He moved to the porch, reaching behind the door where his old Henry rifle rested. The metallic click as he levered around into the chamber was loud in the sudden silence. "Now," Thomas continued conversationally. "I'm asking polite as I know how. Get off my land." Harmon's hand twitched toward his pistol, but one of the cowboys grabbed his arm. "Come on, Jake. Ain't worth dying over." "This ain't over, McKenna," Harmon snarled. "You can't protect her forever. And when we come back, when you come back," Ayanna interrupted, "I will be ready." From somewhere, Thomas never did figure out where, she produced a knife, its blade catching the late afternoon sun. "My grandmother taught me to skin rabbits when I was 5 summers old, Men are not so different, just bigger." The threat, delivered in her musical voice with a slight smile, was somehow more chilling than if she'd screamed it. The cowboys wheeled their horses around, Harmon shouting curses as they retreated. Thomas lowered the rifle, his hands shaking slightly with unused adrenaline. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, but he saw the way her knuckles were white around the knife handle. "They will come back." "Maybe," he admitted, "but we'll be ready." That night, he moved his bedroll to block the door. Ayanna said nothing, but he heard her moving furniture in the bedroom, barricading the window. He guessed they were under siege now, even if the enemy had withdrawn for the moment. "I'm sorry," he said into the darkness. "This is my fault. Bringing you here, making you a target. Tomas," her voice came from the bedroom doorway. "You think I was safer with them? You think I had better place to go?" He turned to see her silhouette against the faint moonlight. "Still, you don't deserve this." "No," she agreed. "But deserving and getting are not the same. You taught me this land gives nothing easy. We fight for what we want to keep." She moved closer, and he could see her face now. "Are you sorry you brought me here?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Never." "Then no more apologies." She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand where it rested on the rifle. "We stand together, or we fall together. This is the way." The touch was brief, but it sent warmth through him like whiskey. He caught her hand before she could withdraw it, holding it gently. "Ayanna, I know," she said softly. "I know what grows between us, but not tonight. Tonight we watch and wait. Tomorrow, if the sun rises on us still living, then we talk of other things." She squeezed his hand once, then returned to the bedroom. Thomas resumed his vigil, but his thoughts were no longer solely on the threat of the cowboys. Something had shifted between them, acknowledged at last. Whatever came next, violence or peace, acceptance or continued persecution, they would face it as more than mere partners. The night passed quietly, but Thomas didn't sleep. He thought about Mary, wondering what she would make of all this. In his heart, he thought she would understand. She'd always said he had too much love in him for one person to hold. Maybe that's why God had brought Ayanna to him, not to replace what he'd lost, but to show him that the heart could expand, could hold grief and hope, past and future, all at once. When dawn broke over the desert, painting the world in shades of gold and rose, Thomas was still at his post. Ayanna emerged from the bedroom, fully dressed and armed with both her knife and one of Mary's old rolling pins. "No one came," she observed. "Not yet." He agreed. "But they will." She nodded, then surprised him by smiling. "Good. I am tired of waiting for life to happen. Better to meet it head-on, like a storm." Despite everything, Thomas found himself smiling back. "You're something else. Ayanna of the Bitterwater clan." "Yes," she said simply. "I am." "And you, Thomas McKenna, are the man who saw that when others saw only something to sell." She moved to the stove to start breakfast. "Now come. We have work. Ranch doesn't run itself. And cowboys with big mouths don't scare the cattle into better pasture." As he watched her work, humming a Navajo song under her breath, Thomas felt a fierce protectiveness rise in him. Let them come. Harmon, Webb, the whole town if necessary. He'd bought her freedom, but she'd chosen to stay, and he'd defend that choice with everything he had. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. Another day on the ranch began, but now with a shadow of threat hanging over them. Thomas cleaned his rifle and counted his ammunition. Ayanna sharpened her knife and practiced throwing it at a post. They were ready for war, but in the quiet moments between preparations, when their eyes met across the yard or their hands touched passing tools, something else entirely was building, something that no amount of prejudice or violence could destroy. Love, like the desert wildflowers, had a way of blooming in the harshest conditions, putting down roots too deep for any storm to tear away. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, as if the very sky sought to test their resolve. The first blizzard struck in early December, transforming the landscape into an alien world of white. Thomas had seen hard winters before, but this one seemed determined to break records and spirits. They had prepared as best they could. The barn was stocked with hay, the root cellar filled with preserved vegetables and salted meat. But no amount of preparation could fully ready them for the siege of cold and isolation that descended upon the ranch. By the third week of relentless snow, the path to town had vanished entirely. The cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Each morning, Thomas and Ayanna would bundle themselves in every piece of warm clothing they owned and venture out to break ice on the water troughs, their faces stinging from the bitter wind. "We're running low on coffee," Ayanna announced one morning, taking inventory of their supplies. She'd become the keeper of their stores, her careful management stretching everything further than Thomas would have managed alone. "And flour," Thomas added, studying the near-empty barrel. "Maybe 2 weeks' worth, if we're careful." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, both understanding what this meant. A trip to town was impossible. The snow lay chest-deep in places, and more was falling. They would have to make do with what they had. "We've survived worse," Ayanna said quietly, and Thomas knew she wasn't talking about the weather. They fell into a routine of strict conservation. Breakfast became a thin porridge stretched with water. Lunch was often skipped entirely. Dinner consisted of whatever game Thomas could trap, rabbits mostly, the occasional grouse. Ayanna supplemented their diet with knowledge from her childhood, showing Thomas which bark could be boiled for tea, which roots remained edible beneath the snow. The house grew colder as their firewood dwindled. They closed off the bedroom entirely, both now sleeping in the main room near the stove. At first, they maintained distance, Ayanna on a pallet near the wall, Thomas closer to the door. But as the temperature continued to drop, practicality overcame propriety. "This is foolish," Ayanna said one particularly brutal night, her teeth chattering despite the blankets piled atop her. "Animals know to share warmth. Are we less wise than animals?" Thomas hesitated. The boundaries they'd carefully maintained for months seemed both crucial and absurd in the face of possible death from cold. "Come here," he said finally, opening his blankets. She came without hesitation, curling against his side like she belonged there. The shock of her closeness, the first time they'd truly touched beyond casual contact, nearly stopped his breath. But as her shivering gradually subsided, replaced by the steady rhythm of sleep, Thomas found himself relaxing too. They woke, tangled together, frost coating the windows and their breath visible in the morning air. Neither spoke of it. But that night, when darkness fell, Ayanna simply gathered her blankets and joined him without asking. It became their new normal. Two bodies sharing warmth against the killing cold, carefully avoiding acknowledgement of how right it felt. The days blurred together. They ventured out only for necessities, tending the animals, gathering snow to melt for water. The rest of the time was spent huddled near the stove, conserving energy. Thomas taught Ayanna card games Mary had enjoyed. She told him stories from her childhood, teaching him words in Navajo that described concepts English couldn't capture. "Kay," she said one afternoon, as they sat sharing a meager meal of rabbit stew. "It means kinship, but more. Connection to all things. People, land, animals, stars. Everything connected. Like a web. Is that what we have?" Thomas asked without thinking. "Kay?" She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. "Yes," she said finally. "We have made K.A. together, you and I." Their food stores continued to shrink. Thomas tried to hide his portions, giving her more, but she noticed and refused to eat unless he did. They were down to one small meal a day when the worst blizzard yet struck, lasting 3 days and nights. The wind howled like a living thing, seeking cracks in the walls to pour its frozen breath through. On the second night of the storm, huddled together under every blanket they owned, Ayanna spoke into the darkness. "If we die here—" "We won't," Thomas interrupted firmly. "But if we do," she persisted. "I want you to know something." She turned in his arms to face him, her breath warm against his cheek. "You gave me back my life, not just by buying my freedom, but by seeing me, by learning my words, my ways, by treating me as equal." "Ayanna." "Let me finish." Her hand found his face in the darkness, fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. "I could have run, many times, could have taken a horse and supplies, found my way back to Navajo lands. But I stayed. Do you know why?" Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. "Why?" "Because somewhere between that first shared meal and now, between fixing fences and learning words, between your stories of Mary and mine of my grandmother, I started to love you. Not from gratitude, not from having no other choice, but truly love you. Thomas McKenna." The wind screamed outside, but in their small circle of warmth, silence reigned. Thomas struggled for words, overwhelmed by the gift she'd given him, not just her love, but the trust to speak it first. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough. "Have for months now. Was just too scared to say it, scared of presuming, of taking advantage." She silenced him with a kiss, soft and sweet despite their chapped lips. It was a kiss that tasted of hardship and hope in equal measure, of two people choosing each other against all odds. When they broke apart, Thomas touched his forehead to hers, a gesture he'd learned was significant in her culture. "You took me when they sold a worthless Navajo girl," she whispered, echoing the words he'd spoken that day in Bitter Creek. "But you loved me untamed, loved me as I am, and I always will," he promised. They held each other through the rest of the storm, no longer just for warmth, but for the simple joy of closeness after months of careful distance. When morning came, the blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, but also by the truth spoken in darkness. Their situation remained dire. Food was critically low, firewood nearly gone, but somehow, acknowledging their love had kindled a new determination. They would survive this together, or not at all. "The storm has passed," Ayanna observed, looking out at the pristine white landscape. "One of them," Thomas agreed, knowing more would come before winter released its grip. She turned to him, a spark of her old fire in her eyes. "Then we better get to work. Spring will come eventually, and I intend to see it. With you." They ventured out together to dig paths to the barn, to check on the cattle, to gather what firewood they could find. The work was exhausting on their weakened bodies, but they attacked it with renewed purpose. Love, it seemed, was its own kind of sustenance. That night, as they shared their meager meal and planned for the days ahead, Thomas marveled at the strange paths life took. He'd lost Mary to fever, thought his heart buried with her. Then came Ayanna, sold as worthless, dismissed as savage, but revealing herself to be the strongest person he'd ever known. Their love had grown slowly, quietly, nurtured by shared work and mutual respect, until it was as natural and necessary as breathing. The winter still stretched before them, brutal and unforgiving. They might yet starve or freeze, but they would face it together, bound by something stronger than law or convention, bound by choice, by love, by the K they had built between them. Outside, coyotes howled at the moon, their voices carrying across the frozen desert. Inside, Thomas and Ayanna sat close by the dying fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, planning for a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. They had found warmth in the coldest winter, love in the harshest landscape, hope in the face of almost certain doom. And that, Thomas thought, was its own kind of miracle. Spring arrived like a miracle, melting the snow and revealing a world that had survived against all odds. Thomas and Ayanna emerged from their winter ordeal thinner but unbroken, their bond forged stronger by shared hardship. The first green shoots pushing through the damp earth seemed to mirror their own renewal, but with the thaw came visitors. The first was Sheriff William Thornton, a man Thomas had always respected for his fairness, though that respect was about to be tested. "Morning, McKenna," the sheriff said, dismounting from his bay gelding. His eyes found Ayanna, who was working in the garden, and his expression grew complicated. "Sheriff," Thomas replied, setting down his hammer. "Coffee?" They sat on the porch, the lawman's discomfort obvious. "I'll get straight to it. Thomas, there's been complaints filed, official ones, about you harboring an Indian woman without proper documentation." "Documentation?" Thomas kept his voice level. "She's a free woman, working my ranch. That may be, but there's laws about Indians living off reservation land. New regulations from Washington." Thornton shifted uncomfortably. "And there's the matter of taxes. Judge Morrison says if she's living here permanent-like, she needs papers, and you owe additional tax for having a resident who ain't family." Thomas felt his jaw clench. Judge Morrison, father to the shopkeeper, and a man who'd never hidden his prejudices. How much? $50 by month's end, and she needs to appear before the court to explain her presence here. It might as well have been $1,000. After the winter, Thomas had perhaps $10 to his name. And if I can't pay, Thornton's face was genuinely regretful. "Then I gotta remove her, take her to the reservation up north, or—" He trailed off. But Thomas knew the alternative. Back to traders like Harmon and Webb. After the sheriff left, Thomas found Ayanna still working, her hands steady despite having heard everything. "We'll fight this," he said. "With what?" She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "You have no money. I have no standing in their court. They make laws to push us out, then punish us for existing. There has to be a way. There is." She touched his face gently. "I leave. Find my people in the north. You keep your ranch. Pay no extra tax." "No." The word came out harder than he intended. "We didn't survive that winter just to let them tear us apart now." The court date was set for 2 weeks hence. Thomas spent the time desperately seeking solutions, considering selling cattle he couldn't spare, looking for legal precedents that didn't exist, even swallowing his pride to ask for loans from neighbors who turned him away with varying degrees of politeness. It was Ayanna who suggested they visit Samuel Whitman, an elderly rancher who lived 10 miles north. "He watches us sometimes when we go to town," she explained, "but his eyes are not cruel." Whitman received them on his porch, his weathered face unreadable. He was near 70, had been in the territory longer than most. His wife served tea while he studied his visitors. "Heard about your troubles," he said finally. "Also heard how you two worked together through that winter. My hired man saw your smoke on the worst days, said it was a miracle you survived." "We managed," Thomas said simply. Whitman's eyes moved to Ayanna. "You speak English well, young woman." "Yes, sir. Thomas taught me, and I read now. Write some, too." The old man was quiet for a moment. "You know, I was at Sand Creek. Soldier then, following orders." His voice grew heavy. "Saw things that day, things that haunt me still. Women and children." He shook his head. "Changed my thinking about a lot of things." He stood abruptly. "Come with me." In his study, Whitman pulled out a leather portfolio. "I've been buying up land patents for years. Investment, you see, but there's one here." He withdrew a document. 40 acres, borders your southeast corner. McKenna. Purchased it from a Spanish grant. Never did anything with it." Thomas frowned, not understanding. Whitman continued. "Funny thing about these old Spanish grants. They recognized Indian property rights, especially for women who married into Spanish families. Course, proving such a marriage from 50 years back is near impossible, but the precedent exists." "I don't follow," Thomas admitted. "Well now, if this land were deeded to an Indian woman who could show historical connection to the area, say, through her grandmother's people who traded with the Spanish, then she'd have legal right to residence. And if she happened to lease that land to an adjacent rancher for, say, $1 a year." Hope bloomed in Thomas's chest. "But Ayanna would need to prove, I've lived here long enough to know the Bitterwater clan traded regular with the Spanish settlements. Got the mission records to prove it. Father Martinez was meticulous about recording every soul he met." Whitman smiled slightly. "Course, I'd need something in return for this land. I don't have much, Thomas began. Not money. Whitman interrupted. A promise. When I die, and it won't be too many more winters, you two look after my Martha. She's got no family left, and I won't rest easy thinking of her alone. Of course, Ayanna said immediately. She would be welcome with us, always. The day of the court appearance arrived overcast and humid. The courthouse in Bitter Creek was packed, half the town turning out for the spectacle. Judge Morrison presided with obvious satisfaction, while Harmon and Webb sat in the front row, smirking. This is a simple matter, the judge began. An Indian woman residing illegally off reservation lands, if it please the court. Samuel Whitman stood, his presence commanding attention. I have documentation relevant to these proceedings. The judge's face soured. This is not your affair, Whitman. Oh, but it is. The old rancher moved forward, documents in hand. This young woman is my legal tenant, residing on property I own free and clear. Property, I might add, that predates the current reservation system. He presented the papers, the land deed, the lease agreement, and most crucially, old mission records showing Bitterwater Navajo trading at Spanish settlements near that very land. Furthermore, Whitman continued, I've employed Miss Ayanna to assist my wife with household duties, making her gainfully employed and contributing to the territorial economy, unless the court wishes to challenge Spanish land grants, which I believe would require federal intervention. She has every right to residence. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morrison's face had gone red. This is highly irregular, but legal, Whitman insisted, unless you have specific charges against Miss Ayanna beyond her ancestry. Thomas watched in amazement as the judge struggled, clearly wanting to find a reason to reject the documents, but knowing Whitman's influence in the territory. The old man had friends in the territorial government, had served with distinction in multiple wars. The court will review these documents, Morrison said finally, grudgingly. Case postponed pending verification. But everyone knew it was over. The judge couldn't openly reject legitimate paperwork, not with half the town watching. As they filed out, Harmon blocked their path. This ain't over, he snarled. Papers or no papers, that savage don't belong here. Careful, Harmon, Whitman said mildly. Threatening my legal tenant could be construed as threatening me, and I'm not as forgiving as young McKenna here. That evening, back at the ranch, they celebrated quietly with a meal Whitman and his wife shared. The old couple's presence filled the house with warmth. Martha Whitman and Ayanna already talking like old friends. Why? Thomas asked Whitman privately. Why help us? The old man gazed out at the desert sunset. Because I've seen what hate does. Carried it myself for too many years. Maybe this is my way of balancing the scales a bit. He paused. Also, Martha hasn't smiled like that in months. She needs friends. Needs purpose. Your Ayanna gave her that today just by listening to her stories. After the Whitmans left, Thomas and Ayanna stood together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The land that had seemed so empty when he'd first brought her here now felt full of possibility. We won today, Ayanna said softly. Whitman won, Thomas corrected. We just benefited. She shook her head. No, we won because we didn't face it alone, because good people still exist, because love is stronger than hate, even when hate writes the laws. Thomas pulled her close, marveling at her strength, her ability to find hope in the smallest victories. What happens when Morrison verifies those documents? Then I am a legal resident, a person with rights. Not full rights. I am still Indian, still woman, but rights enough to stay, to build a life. She looked up at him. To marry, if someone asks. Thomas's heart skipped. They'd spoken of love through the winter, but marriage, that would challenge even more boundaries. Would you want that, knowing how people would react? I have never cared what people think, she said simply. I care what you think, what we build together. Then I better start planning how to ask properly, Thomas said, earning one of her rare, brilliant smiles. The future remained uncertain. There would be more challenges, more prejudice, more attempts to tear them apart. But tonight, they had won a victory, not through violence or running, but through community, through an old soldier's change of heart, through the slow, patient work of proving their humanity to those willing to see it. As they went inside, Ayanna paused at the door, the judge's face. She said with quiet satisfaction, "When he realized he couldn't dismiss me so easily, that was worth all of it." Thomas laughed, the sound rich and full. After months of hardship, they had earned this moment of joy, this small triumph over those who would deny them happiness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they were home. They were together, and they were staying. The court's verification of the documents took 3 weeks, during which Thomas and Ayanna worked their land with renewed purpose. When word finally came that Judge Morrison had grudgingly accepted the legality of Whitman's arrangement, they celebrated quietly, knowing the real battles were far from over. It was a month later, on a warm evening in early June, when that truth became violently clear. Thomas had gone to check on the cattle in the far pasture, leaving Ayanna to tend the garden. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, when he heard Buttercup's urgent whinny from the direction of the house. He spurred his horse hard, arriving to find 3 horses tied at his fence and the front door standing open. His blood went cold. Drawing his rifle from its scabbard, he approached cautiously, then heard Ayanna's voice, steady but with an edge that made his heart race. "I said no, in English and in Navajo. Which word confuses you?" Thomas entered to find Harmon and Webb blocking Ayanna in the kitchen, while a third man, one of the Broken Spur cowboys, rifled through their belongings. "Well, look who's home," Webb drawled, his hand resting on his pistol. "We were just having a friendly conversation with your woman here." "Get out," Thomas said, his rifle held steady but not yet aimed. "Now." Harmon laughed. "Or what, you'll shoot us? 3 against 1 ain't good odds. Farmer, 4 against 3. Ayanna corrected, in her hands. She held the cast-iron skillet like a weapon. "And I don't miss." The tension stretched taut as wire. Thomas could see Harmon calculating, weighing his chances. The man's hatred for seeing a white man with an Indian woman had festered into something dangerous. "You think those papers make you safe?" Harmon spat. "You think playing house with this savage makes you something special? You're a disgrace to your race, McKenna. The only disgrace here is you." Thomas replied evenly. "Men who prey on the defenseless, who see people as property. Now get out before I forget I'm trying to be civilized." It happened fast. The cowboy by the cupboard went for his gun, and Thomas swung his rifle that direction. But Webb was already moving, drawing his pistol. The room exploded in motion. Ayanna's skillet caught Webb square in the face with a sickening crunch, dropping him like a stone. Thomas's rifle butt connected with the cowboy's temple before he could clear leather. But Harmon had his gun out, the barrel swinging toward Ayanna. Thomas moved without thinking, stepping between them as the gun fired. The impact spun him around, hot pain blooming in his shoulder. He heard Ayanna scream, not in fear, but in fury. Through the haze of pain, Thomas saw her move like flowing water. The knife appeared in her hand as if by magic, and suddenly Harmon was backing away, blood streaming from a gash across his gun hand. The pistol clattered to the floor. "You want to see Savage?" Ayanna's voice was deadly quiet. She stalked forward, and Harmon scrambled backward. "My grandmother fought the Mexican soldiers when they came for slaves. My mother killed 2 men who tried to take her sister, and you think I am weak because I choose peace." She grabbed Harmon by the shirt, the knife point resting against his throat. "I could open you like a deer, leave you for the coyotes. No one would question it. Defending my home, my man." "Ayanna," Thomas gasped, trying to stay conscious. "Don't. You're better than him." She held Harmon's terrified gaze for a long moment, then shoved him away. "Go, take your friends. If you come back, I won't be so merciful." The 3 men stumbled out, Webb supported between the other 2. all fight beaten out of them. Thomas heard horses galloping away as his legs gave out. Ayanna catching him as he fell. "Stubborn man," she muttered, already tearing fabric for bandages. "Always trying to protect me when I can protect myself." "Habit," he managed, gritting his teeth as she examined the wound. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder, painful but not fatal if kept clean. She worked with skilled hands, cleaning and binding the wound. "My aunt was a healer," she explained. "Taught me about wounds, infection. You'll live, but you'll hurt. Worth it." Thomas said, "They were going to—" "I know what they were going to do." Her hands stilled for a moment. "But they didn't. We stopped them. Together." As she helped him to bed, Thomas caught her hand. "That move with the skillet? Where did you learn that?" "Despite everything," she smiled slightly, "you're not the only one who had a protective spouse. My grandmother said a good skillet was better than a gun, useful for cooking and defense." News of the confrontation spread quickly. Sheriff Thornton arrived the next morning, taking statements. Webb had a broken nose and possible concussion. Harmon needed stitches for his hand. The cowboy had a lump the size of a hen's egg on his head. "They're claiming you attacked them," Thornton said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "In our own home." Ayanna's voice was ice. "With Thomas's blood still on my floor. I'm just telling you what they're saying." The sheriff sighed. "But Samuel Whitman already came to town. Said he saw them riding out here looking for trouble. His word carries weight." "Will they be charged?" Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. "Doubt it. Their word against yours. And—" Thornton glanced at Ayanna. "Well, you know how it is, but I also doubt they'll bother you again. Word is, Webb's talking about heading to California. Harmon, too, once his hand heals." After the sheriff left, Thomas and Ayanna sat together on the porch, watching the morning sun climb higher. His shoulder throbbed, but the pain seemed insignificant compared to what they'd survived. "I froze," Thomas admitted. "When Harmon pointed that gun at you, for a second, I saw Mary dying all over again. Couldn't bear the thought." "But you didn't freeze," Ayanna corrected gently. "You moved. You put yourself between danger and me. That's not freezing. That's choosing. You saved us," he said. "Your speed, your skill, I've never seen anything like it." She was quiet for a moment. "I told you my grandmother taught me, but I didn't tell you why. When I was young, soldiers came to our camp. My grandmother fought them off with nothing but a knife and courage. She was wounded, but she saved us children. Later, she made sure all the girls learned. Men will always think you're weak. She said, 'Let 'em, but be ready.' She sounds formidable. She would have liked you, I think, a man who sees strength in women, who doesn't need to make others small to feel big." She touched his face gently. "You honored me today, not by protecting me, by trusting me to protect myself." A week later, Samuel Whitman visited with news. Harmon and Webb left town yesterday. Heard they're headed west, planning to try their luck in the gold fields. He studied Thomas's healing shoulder. Also heard what really happened. Martha's telling everyone how those men had it coming, attacking a woman in her own home. "Martha's talking about it?" Ayanna asked, surprised. "Oh, yes. She's quite vocal about the injustice of it all. Even got some of the other women riled up. Mrs. Patterson actually spoke to you in Morrison's yesterday, didn't she?" It was true. The preacher's wife had nodded to Ayanna and commented on the weather. A small gesture, but significant in its acknowledgement of her as a person worthy of conversation. "Change comes slow," Whitman said, "but it comes. Every person who sees you two together, working your land, living with dignity, it chips away at their certainty that different peoples can't build lives together." That evening, as Thomas's shoulder allowed him to move more freely, he found Ayanna at her new pastime, teaching herself to read from Mary's small collection of books. She was working through Pilgrim's Progress, sounding out the difficult words. "I want to write our story someday," she said, "so people will know, not the story others tell about us, but the truth, How a lonely man and a woman thought worthless found worth in each other. Thomas sat beside her, their shoulders touching. What would you call it? She thought for a moment. They sold a worthless Navajo girl. She said, but that's only how it started. The real story is what came after, how he loved me untamed, how we chose each other despite everything. That's a good title. Thomas agreed. Though I'd argue with worthless. You were never that. They just couldn't see your value. No, she said softly. You saw it from the beginning. You saw me as human. That's the miracle. Thomas, not that you saved me, but that you saw me. As night fell over their small ranch, they sat together in peaceful silence. The confrontation with Harmon and Webb had been their trial by fire, proving they could defend what they'd built. Thomas's wound would heal, leaving only a scar to remind them of the price of prejudice. But more than that, they'd proven something to themselves and to their community. They were not victim and savior, not master and servant, not even just man and woman from different worlds. They were partners, equals, each strong in their own way, each choosing daily to build a life together despite the forces arrayed against them. The desert stars emerged one by one, ancient lights that had witnessed countless stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy. Now they watched over Thomas and Ayanna, two people who had found in each other not just love, but recognition, the profound gift of being truly seen and accepted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be those who couldn't accept their union, who saw difference as threat. But tonight, they were safe, they were together, and they were writing their own story. One day, one choice, one act of courage at a time. The ranch flourished that summer like the desert after rain. The cattle grew fat on good grass. The garden produced more than they could eat, and even the old apple tree that hadn't borne fruit in years suddenly burst with blossoms. Thomas liked to joke that the land itself was celebrating their happiness. Ayanna had planted traditional Navajo crops alongside the vegetables, corn, beans, and squash growing together in the way of her people. She called them the Three Sisters, explaining how each plant helped the others grow. Like us, she said one morning, surveying their thriving garden, stronger together than alone. The healing between them and the community continued slowly. Martha Whitman visited weekly now, and her friendship with Ayanna had sparked something unexpected. Other women began to nod in greeting, then to speak, then to actually converse. Mrs. Patterson had even asked for Ayanna's recipe for fry bread after tasting it at a church gathering they'd cautiously attended. Change is like water on stone. Ayanna observed one evening, drop by drop, it wears away the hardest resistance. It was on such an evening, as purple twilight painted the mountains, that Thomas finally asked the question that had been burning in his heart for months. They were sitting by the creek that ran through their property, swollen with summer rains, when he took her hand. Ayanna, he began, then stopped, suddenly nervous as a schoolboy. She waited patiently, that small smile playing at her lips that told him she knew what was coming. We've built something here, something good and strong and true. Yes, she agreed simply. I want to make it official. Not for them, for us. I want to call you my wife in front of God and whoever will witness it. He pulled out a simple silver ring, one that had been his mother's. Will you marry me? She looked at the ring, then at his face, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. In my culture, she said softly, marriage is not just between two people. It joins families, clans, histories. But I have no family to bring you. Nay, you have yourself, Thomas said firmly. That's more than enough. And we'll make our own family, our own traditions. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, Thomas McKenna, I will marry you and be proud to do it. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, at sunset, in the meadow behind their ranch where the wildflowers bloomed in riotous color. It was a small gathering. Samuel and Martha Whitman, Sheriff Thornton and his wife, the Patterson family, and a handful of others who had come to see them as people rather than a scandal. Ayanna wore a dress she had made herself, combining elements of both cultures. The practical cut of a frontier woman's garment decorated with traditional Navajo patterns she'd embroidered during the long winter nights. Her hair was braided with desert flowers and the silver clips that had been her mother's, one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep. Reverend Patterson performed the ceremony, having overcome his initial reluctance after what his wife called a good talking to. His words were simple but heartfelt, speaking of love that transcended boundaries and the courage to build bridges where others saw only walls. When it came time for vows, Ayanna spoke first, her voice clear and strong. "Thomas McKenna, you looked at me when others saw nothing. You gave me shelter when I had none. But more than that, you gave me respect. You learned my language, my ways. You saw my strength as a gift, not a threat. I choose you as my husband, my partner, my home, in joy and sorrow, in plenty and want, in acceptance and adversity. I am yours." Thomas had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. "Ayanna, you transformed my empty existence into a life worth living. You brought light to my darkness, strength to my weakness, hope to my despair. They sold you as worthless, but you are beyond price. You came to me tamed by hardship, but I love your wild spirit, your fierce heart, your gentle soul. I promise to honor you, to stand beside you, to learn from you, and to love you until my last breath." As they exchanged rings, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the desert air. Ayanna smiled up at it. "A good sign," she murmured. "The spirits approve." The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. Martha Whitman had insisted on baking the cake, and other women had brought dishes to share. There was fiddle music and dancing, and for a few hours, the differences that usually divided them seemed to fade away. "Never thought I'd see the day," Samuel Whitman said to Thomas during a quiet moment. "When folks around here could look past skin color to see love, we've still got a long way to go." Thomas replied, watching Ayanna laugh with Martha over some shared joke. "True," the old man agreed. "But every journey starts with a single step. You two took that step and others are following." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to offer genuine congratulations. Even Judge Morrison's wife, who had come out of curiosity more than approval, pressed Ayanna's hand and wished her well when they were finally alone, standing on their porch under a canopy of stars. Ayanna leaned against Thomas with a contented sigh. "We did it," she said. "Despite everything, we're here." "Was it what you hoped?" Thomas asked, suddenly anxious that the simple ceremony hadn't been enough. She turned in his arms to face him. "It was perfect, not because it was grand, but because it was real. Those people came to witness our love, not from duty, but from choice. That means more than all the fancy ceremonies in the world." They went inside to the home they had built together, no longer his house where she stayed, but their home where they belonged. The rooms that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with life. Navajo blankets hung alongside frontier quilts, her herbs dried next to his tools. Two cultures, two histories, woven together into something new and beautiful. "I have something for you," Ayanna said, producing a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather journal, its cover decorated with beadwork. "For your thoughts, your stories, our story." Thomas ran his fingers over the careful workmanship. "It's beautiful. When did you—" "Winter nights are long," she said with a smile. "I wanted you to have something made by my hands, carrying my love. Then I'll fill it with our adventures." He promised, starting with how a lonely farmer bought his happiness for $10. "No," she corrected gently. "Start with how two broken people chose to heal together, how love grew in the desert like wildflowers after rain, how we proved that home isn't about where you come from, but who you choose to stand beside." That night, as they lay together as husband and wife, the desert winds sang through the windows, not the harsh howl of winter storms, but the gentle whisper of summer nights. Outside, coyotes called to their mates, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted its ancient wisdom. My grandmother once told me, Ayana said softly into the darkness, that every person has many lives within one lifetime. The life before sorrow, the life during sorrow, and if we're blessed, the life after sorrow finds meaning. She traced patterns on Thomas's chest, over his heart. This is my afterlife, here with you, and mine, Thomas replied, pulling her closer. Mary gave me my first happiness. You gave me my second chance. Different loves, but both true. She would be glad, Ayana said with certainty. A good woman wants her man to find joy again. Through you, I honor her memory by loving what she loved. They fell asleep to the sound of night birds and the distant yip of coyotes. Two souls no longer alone in the vastness of the desert. The ranch house, once a monument to loss, had become a testament to resilience, to the possibility of finding love in the most unexpected places. Morning would come with its usual demands: cattle to tend, crops to water, fences to mend. There would still be those who disapproved, who saw their marriage as an affront to the natural order. But there would also be friends, neighbors who had learned to see past prejudice to the simple truth of two people building a life together. The desert endured, harsh and beautiful, demanding and generous by turns, and in its heart, a small ranch thrived, tended by hands that had learned to work together, hearts that had learned to beat as one. The woman once sold as worthless had become precious beyond measure. The man who had lost everything had found even more. They had written their own story in defiance of those who would have authored tragedy. Instead, they chose love, wild and untamed as the land itself, but as enduring as the mountains that watched over them. And in that choice, they found not just happiness, but home, a place where two cultures met and merged, where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where love was stronger than law and compassion mightier than convention. The desert stars wheeled overhead, eternal witnesses to the endless human story of connection across division, of love conquering fear, of two people choosing each other again and again, creating their own small universe of belonging in a world that often seemed determined to keep them apart. This was their victory, not grand or dramatic, but as quiet and certain as sunrise after the longest night. They were home, they were family, they were proof that love, indeed, knows no boundaries. Thank you for listening to this story of love and resilience from the Wild West. We'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps somewhere unexpected? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reactions mean the world to us. Until next time, partners.